Hola a todos los que se van conectando, ya saben, porfa, me confirman si está bien el audio, el video y todo. Ya se conectó el doctor Trexler. Esperamos que se incorpore. ¿Me escuchan bien? Doctor Trexler, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Fine, fine. Can you hear me well? Can you see me well?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Is it good if I go by Dr. Trexler? Do you prefer Eric? You tell me.
You can just call me Eric.
Sure, will do. Is it okay if I introduce you in Spanish and then we'll go on in English?
Sure.
Very well. Hola a todos, qué bueno que nos están acompañando. Estamos el día de hoy con Eric Trexler. Él tiene mucha investigación. Tan solo métanse a ResearchGate, buscan Eric Trexler y les van a salir un montón de papers en los que él ha colaborado. Para los que estén suscritos a más Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, él es parte de las personas que hacen reseñas mes con mes de un montón de artículos y aparte es fisicoculturista natural. Si vieron por ahí la fotografía que utilicé para promocionar el live, pues lo han podido ver en su fase competitiva. Y bueno, sin más, el día de hoy vamos a estar hablando de adaptaciones metabólicas. De aquí en adelante nos vamos a ir en inglés, pero yo en estos días voy a hacer un post en español sobre todos los puntos que toquemos el día de hoy. Todas las preguntas que tengan las pueden ir dejando en español, no se preocupen, yo me encargo de traducirlas. Y pues bueno, sin más, vamos a comenzar. Thanks in advance. Again, I'm really, really honored. I've been subscribed to Mass for a really long time. I've seen virtually every podcast you've been in with Jeff Nippert. I was watching one with Mike Matthews about precisely metabolic adaptation. I had the opportunity to meet you in Mexico City. It was last year in the One Fitness weekend. I don't know if you recall that.
Absolutely, yeah. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
Sure, it was pretty sweet. So anyway, the topic I like to cover today is metabolic adaptation and have a conversation with you precisely on such topic because well, I actually used several of your papers in my own classes. Like I was telling you, I'm a professor. So well, we actually reviewed some of these implications of metabolic adaptation, but mostly I think there is a lot of probably misunderstandings and several myths, like we can say about metabolic damage, starvation mode, and basically I would like to begin from the top, like basically what is actually metabolic adaptation, if you will.
Yeah, metabolic adaptation is basically just a collection of physiological adaptations that our body makes in response to energy restriction and then eventually weight loss. If we restrict energy long enough, then we induce weight loss. Metabolic adaptation, from my perspective, just describes all the ways our body responds to that process of restricting energy and losing weight. A lot of people, when they talk about metabolic adaptation, they focus on a reduction in resting metabolic rate. And yes, that occurs. It's a thing that exists, but I think that's a very narrow scope when it comes to the overall concept of metabolic adaptation, because we see there's a lot more involved in that. We have a reduction in resting metabolic rate, but we also have a more important reduction in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And then, of course, we have a change in a variety of different hormones, and that can impact our body composition and our hunger management and satiety management.
Very well. I can see that there are several compartments to this metabolic adaptation, one being, and we kind of tend to focus probably not correctly on that one, which is resting metabolic rate. But one of the big key components, I think, in regards to metabolic adaptation is actually NEAT, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. How does this component of total energy expenditure get alterated by the energy restriction? How is basically how do the pieces fit together, basically?
Yeah, so when we look at total daily energy expenditure, we've got our resting metabolic rate, which is fairly synonymous with basal metabolic rate. There's some slight differences, but they're more or less the same thing. We've got resting metabolic rate. We've got the thermic effect of feeding. We've got the energy we burn during exercise, and then we've also got non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so the calories that we burn doing physical activity that isn't structured exercise. So this is the calories involved with just maintaining our posture, walking around the house, sweeping the floor, doing the dishes, whatever we're doing. And what we see is that non-exercise activity thermogenesis really markedly can be reduced in response to energy restriction. This is a much more impactful change than the change we see in something like resting metabolic rate, for example. And ultimately, in terms of what drives that reduction, we see that when we restrict energy and we start losing body fat, leptin levels go down. So leptin is a hormone that responds a little bit to short-term energy availability, but also just to how much energy is stored in our fat cells. And when we restrict energy and we start losing fat mass, leptin levels go down. And a part of our brain called the hypothalamus senses that. Leptin goes up to its receptors in the hypothalamus, binds to those, and that's how our hypothalamus basically knows how much energy we have available. And the hypothalamus is a really key center of the brain that regulates essentially energy balance. It regulates our desire to eat. It has a huge impact on hunger and satiety. It has a huge impact on our physical activity levels subconsciously. So the hypothalamus brings in all this information about energy status and then starts to impact various aspects of our physiology that impact energy intake and energy expenditure. So when leptin gets low, the hypothalamus senses that due to those leptin receptors, and it basically downregulates our non-exercise activity expenditure. So subconsciously, we will have changes in our posture. We'll have changes in the likelihood that we're going to get up and walk around the room instead of staying seated. We'll see that some of these changes are voluntary and some are involuntary, but the hypothalamus controls essentially all of the involuntary reductions that we see in non-exercise activity.
Right. I think this is something you can experience, at least personally I have. Last time I tried to get really, really lean, like I'd never been before. And it's something kind of funny because, like you said, I think if the room was literally on fire, there was a point that I would really consider getting off of my chair and say, it's not really worth it. I think I'm gonna stay. I'm enjoying the heat. It's very nice. And mostly it's I think the behavioral aspect in regards to need, it's something that we can actually experience, because if we talk about resting metabolic rate, well, it's not like I'm gonna measure resting metabolic rate directly and then adjust my calorie intake. I don't know, but if I actually look at my cell phone to say something, or my smartwatch, and if I see that my step count is going down, well, maybe then I can actually manipulate all these adaptations.
Yeah, and I mean, it is something that even my colleagues noticed about me. So you'll notice yourself if you look at your step count, you'll say, "Wow, it keeps going down," kind of without thinking about it. But the last time I did a bodybuilding competition, I got very, very lean, and I was still working at the university at the time. And my posture when I was sitting at my desk changed. I wasn't sitting upright and moving around a lot. I was just kind of like slouched over my desk, barely moving. And people noticed and they mentioned it. They're like, "What is happening? You look like you're collapsed on your desk." And I wasn't thinking about it, but you'll see even just those really little postural changes where your body is kind of subconsciously trying to conserve some of that energy. And again, that's largely dictated by the hypothalamus.
Sure, sure. I also noticed when I was teaching class, I was like lazy to talk to whatever. I was like, the less words I can speak, the better. And it's something you just have to suck it up, I guess, at a certain point in contest press per se. But I think the the important aspect about metabolic adaptation for most people, because most people don't really want to be shredded, like have straight glutes or whatever, it's how impactful it really is in regards to any weight loss attempt.
Yeah, I mean the impacts are very wide ranging. It's like I said, there's the postural stuff, and just you mentioned just not being as likely to want to interact as much and speak the same
Yeah,
way you
sure.
otherwise would. The impacts are wide ranging. And then of course, another reason people think about it, is because their energy expenditure will go down, and so their weight loss becomes harder as they go. That's a really common thing. And then also there's the hormonal aspects, right? So as a male who's doing energy restriction and weight loss and getting very, very, very lean, you'll start to notice testosterone levels going down, lower energy level, lower libido, which is unpleasant. And then for females, we'll start to see disruption of the menstrual cycle. And those hormonal effects are also, much like non-exercise activity, those are dictated by the hypothalamus.
Can we actually begin to explain all these adaptations with maybe the hormonal component, say leptin, say in males testosterone, or how can we begin to fit all these pieces together and then move on forward to mitochondrial efficiency, this production of ATP that I think it was in your paper actually, the proton leak goes down because all of this. How does this fit together? Can we say that it's actually first the hormonal aspect, or is it first the cellular component, the mitochondrial efficiency?
Well, the convenient thing about, as we try to separate things out and say, well, let's talk about the hormones and let's talk about the proton leak or the mitochondrial efficiency, and let's talk about the leptin and the hypothalamus. The good news is they all fit together so that it's actually kind of hard to separate them. That you kind of want to discuss them all at the same time because they all fit together so perfectly. So we already kind of laid the foundation, right? So energy is restricted. Fat cells are losing energy because we're burning fat, losing fat mass. Leptin goes down as a response, and the hypothalamus senses that. So if you want to look at the hormonal aspects, we will see a drop in thyroid hormone, for example. We'll see an increase in ghrelin, which is related to hunger. We'll see a reduction in sex hormone levels. We'll see all these wide-ranging hormonal changes. But when you look at whenever you look at endocrine physiology, the physiology of hormones, we talk about hormone cascades. Right, so there's usually 2 or 3 different, parts of the body that are releasing some kind of precursor to the hormone, and we kind of follow the production of a hormone from the top all the way down, right? So there's, the first hormone gets released, then the second hormone gets released, and then we get thyroid hormone or estrogen or testosterone. So the really interesting thing, with metabolic adaptation, we see thyroid hormone go down. We see female sex hormones, male sex hormones like testosterone go down. Well, when we follow those hormone cascades all the way up to the top, to the very beginning, we end up at the hypothalamus. Okay, so it's a very clear representation of how all of these pieces fall into place, and really leptin is the thing that's driving it. So leptin gets low, it impacts the hypothalamus, and that impacts all those hormonal cascades from the top down. So, for example, there could be a million reasons, figuratively speaking, why thyroid hormone might be down. For some people, it could be an actual condition with the thyroid gland itself. And so when we look at metabolic adaptation, for example, thyroid hormone is low, but in most cases, there's nothing wrong with your thyroid. It's the structures higher in the cascade are not giving the thyroid the message to actually produce thyroid hormone. It's because the hypothalamus is sensing that lack of energy that everything below that the hypothalamus in that cascade is starting to get impacted.
Right.
So that's kind of the hormonal piece. And when it comes to, sorry, I'm getting like a million Instagram notifications. So I mentioned that proton leak plays a role in this, right? Proton leak is related to all this and mitochondrial efficiency. So a great example is what we see is leptin does impact brown adipose tissue activation. So the effect of leptin itself, the fact that leptin has gone down means that an individual will probably have a little bit less activation of brown adipose tissue. And brown adipose tissue is unique because it has mitochondria that are very prone to leakage. So when brown adipose tissue is stimulated, it starts producing a lot of heat. It's doing processes that make ATP, but very inefficiently. There's a lot of proton leakage happening in those mitochondria, which means we're burning a ton of calories, but not making as much ATP per calorie burned. Another aspect is thyroid hormone, which can impact the relative efficiency of mitochondria in cells. So when we see that thyroid hormone goes down, that also can impact how much of that proton leak is occurring and how much of that inefficient metabolism is going on. So again, we follow this path all the way back to leptin in the hypothalamus, and it starts to affect other things downstream. And so these things all tie together, right? We've got a reduction in leptin, the hypothalamus senses that, and because of what's happening in the hypothalamus, we see all these downstream effects on a variety of different hormones and also on proton leak or the efficiency of our mitochondria. And just to be super clear, when we talk about proton leak and mitochondria, mitochondria work to create ATP. That's the energy currency of the cell. We need to make ATP to continue staying alive. And the way we do that is we break down fat and carbohydrate mostly. We use that energy to create ATP, and we burn off some heat in the process. It's not 100% efficient. We don't, perfectly conserve all the energy when we convert carbohydrate or fat into ATP. So when we talk about mitochondrial efficiency, what we're talking about is how much waste happens. So how many calories do we burn to create a certain amount of ATP? And so when we talk about proton leak, what that means is the mitochondria are creating ATP, but because there's a lot of proton leak occurring, they're doing it inefficiently. So there's a lot of energy being wasted, which for fat loss is a great thing. It means you're burning a lot of calories to create the same amount of ATP. So proton leak in a normal range for fat loss purposes is kind of nice because we're burning extra calories to create the same amount of ATP. So with metabolic adaptation, lower thyroid hormone, less brown adipose tissue activation, we see less proton leak, which means more mitochondrial efficiency, which means for a certain amount of ATP, we're burning fewer calories and breaking down less carbohydrate and fat.
So basically, as the duration and the magnitude of the deficit, we begin to be a little bit more efficient in regards to energy production. And we can explain that by the hormonal aspect, by the mitochondrial efficiency. So basically, as we go on and on and on with the deficit, let's say maybe at the final weeks of a contest prep is when you really, really have a bad time with pretty much everything.
Yeah. I mean, the further we go, we see that some of that efficiency in terms of energy production goes up. And unfortunately, that usually results in a slight reduction in total energy expenditure. And so we have to work just a little bit harder to make sure that we're burning off those calories to stay in a big deficit so that we continue losing fat along the way.
And I think it's funny because all these things that happen, all these processes, basically is what kept us alive a lot of years ago, and now is what we struggle with to lose all those extra pounds. I think it's just kind of funny, we're fighting.
Our goal is to lose fat most of the time when we're talking about this stuff, and so we're thinking about our goal, and we want to lose the fat, and so anything that slows us down in that process, it's really annoying. We kind of hate it. It's very frustrating to us that our weight loss is slowing down. We're getting hungrier and things of that nature. But like you mentioned, this was all supposed to help us back in the day. So before we could go to the market or the grocery store and get food, we weren't always certain that we were going to have access to more food. So if our body sensed that energy wasn't available, that was a threat to starvation. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, it's quite good that we have these mechanisms in place to help us conserve energy when it seems like there's no food around.
Not so good when you're gonna get straight and glutes and win any contest.
Not so good.
It's kind of a big pain. So can we say that, okay, knowing all of this, can we start a weight loss phase by adjusting the magnitude and the duration of said deficit? Or is it a place in time when we can be a little bit more aggressive, less aggressive? for most people, what do you think works best? Being aggressive, let's say at the beginning of the weight loss, and then slow down a bit, knowing all this that we know nowadays, or just go steady on a steady pace the whole time?
So it really depends on the context. So if someone has a lot of extra body fat and they're just trying to lose weight to get healthier, they're not trying to get shredded. They just want to lose weight to get healthier, and they have a lot of weight to lose. I think it does make sense to start out aggressive. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're making a lot of progress. And so if you're only letting yourself lose, half a pound a week, and you want to lose 150 pounds, that's going to be a really long time, right?
Sure.
So we want to make sure that we're getting close to where we want to go. But for someone in a very different scenario, someone who is doing a bodybuilding competition, they're 30 pounds over stage weight and they want to lose 30 pounds. For those individuals, I recommend generally a slow rate of weight loss. So losing maybe 0.5% of body weight per week, maybe up to 1% of body weight per week, and trying to keep it steady as you go. Now, as we've talked about, this is going to get harder as we keep going. So the more weight we've lost and the more shredded we get, when we start getting down to very low body fat levels, this is going to get harder and harder. And so that's why I say I plan on trying to keep things pretty steady as we go, but it will get harder. It will probably slow down, and we're going to have to work a little bit harder the further we go. But like I said, for a lot of people, whether or not you need to spend a lot of time worrying about metabolic adaptation, it depends on the context. It depends on how much weight you have to lose and how lean you're trying to get. So sometimes I'll have people ask me, just for an example, let's say you are a male and you are, maybe currently 17% body fat and you want to get to 13% body fat, right? You just want to lose a little bit of weight, feel better, look better, etc. So for those individuals, we're not losing a lot of total body mass, and we're not really getting like super, super, super lean. And so for that individual, we really don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff. Going from, what was it, like 17 to 13% body fat or something like that, we're not going to see big reductions in testosterone. We're not going to see huge reductions in energy expenditure or thyroid hormone. This stuff gets more relevant when we talk about the extremes. When we talk about someone who's trying to lose 10, 15, 20% of their body weight, when we talk about somebody who's trying to get as lean as a human being can get safely and without harm, that's where we start to see the extremes, and we have to pay more close attention. And there are some people, hormones are complicated, right? So there are some people, what we'll see with, especially with biological males, when body fat gets higher, we'll start to see testosterone go down a little bit and estrogen go up a little bit. So for some people, weight loss will actually improve their testosterone levels, right? So if you've got plenty of extra body fat and you actually have low testosterone and high estrogen because of that body fat, you might actually see the opposite of what we're talking about. You might get to a healthier body fat level, notice that your testosterone actually goes up. So a lot of this is very contextually dependent, and that's what makes it hard to write articles about this stuff. And that's why if you go to strongerbyscience.com, I've got the metabolic adaptation manual.
Sure.
It is by far the longest thing I've ever written. And it's because you have to be really careful about how you frame this. The last thing I would want to do is convince somebody who has excess body fat and low testosterone that they shouldn't lose that body fat and get to a healthier body fat range because they're worried their testosterone is going to drop even more, when in fact the opposite could occur. So that's a long answer. It's complicated stuff.
Don't worry. Yeah, I think it's mostly misunderstanding for the most part. That, okay, let's say we have a male, 20% something fat, body fat. We begin to worry about metabolic adaptation, about the drop in testosterone, which is really non-relevant. We would only see that, and it will only be relevant in a contest prep, which is a really specific scenario. It's not like everybody, like I said, wants to get striated glutes or wants to go down that route. When most people say, I want to get lean, I want to look better, they really don't mean I want to look bodybuilding better. So that's actually kind of the next point. How relevant is for most people to actually pay attention to metabolic adaptation, to pay attention specifically to the need component of energy expenditure? Is it really worth it? Because um, it's kind of stressful to have a step count and you start feeling like, I still have 10K steps to go. I still have all this. Is it really gonna pay off in the long term for most people, or do you think it's a tool that we should reserve for these type scenarios?
Yeah, I think it's valuable to be aware of it. And how much you worry about it, of course, is going to depend on your situation. But, you know, of course, if you're trying to get very, very, very lean, look like a, fitness model, bodybuilder, stuff like that, it's going to become relevant and you probably need to know about this stuff just so that you can plan for it and not be alarmed when you notice, hey, I feel like my testosterone's low, or this is getting really hard at the end. Why is that? Is there something wrong? The answer is no, there's nothing wrong. This is something that you should be aware of and can plan for.
Right.
When it comes to, people that are losing a lot of body fat, it is relevant. One of the challenging things is that losing body fat, people have a pretty high success rate. When we look at the research literature on weight loss interventions, it's pretty straightforward. We can very effectively help people lose weight, but weight regain is a very common issue. A lot of people
Sure.
lose the weight, but they struggle to keep it off and they end up regaining it. And I think knowing about metabolic adaptation, if you're losing 10, 15, 20% of your body weight, you are going to have a reduction in total energy expenditure. And I think it's useful to know about that ahead of time so that when you are doing it and it starts getting harder, it's very comforting to know why that is. It helps you plan out what you're going to actually do about that. It helps you stay focused and recognize that there is a solution. When things start getting more challenging, you start to wonder, am I at the end of the road? Is this just not going to work anymore? The answer is no, it will continue working, but because we understand why this is happening, we understand what we can do about it. So I think it's always helpful to know about, but for certain people, it's going to be much more relevant than others. So for an individual who is not losing a lot of total body weight and is not getting super lean, it's nice to know about some of these things, but it's not critical. But when we're talking about people who are losing substantial amounts of body weight and are hoping to keep it off for a very long time, it's helpful to anticipate these reductions in energy expenditure so that
Sure.
you can focus on keeping your non-exercise activity high with something like a step count or other metrics you can use. Or just adding additional walks throughout your day, having a little walk at lunchtime and a walk in the evening or something like that. So planning for those reductions in NEAT and planning for the reductions in non-exercise total energy expenditure so that you have a plan where you'll continue reducing calories over time or continue increasing energy expenditure over time. So we can't stop it from happening. We can certainly do some things to prevent exaggerating it or exacerbating it. We can try to attenuate it as much as possible, but realistically, we can't stop this from happening, but it's very helpful to expect it and to know it exists so that we can actually put a plan together.
Sure, and I also think the selection of words makes a huge difference. For instance, a long time ago, people used to call it metabolic damage. Here in Mexico, it was called metabolic dump, tumba metabolica. It's kind of sounds scary. It sounds like you're damaged. You're like you said, it's the end of the road. There's nothing you can do. Your metabolism is screwed up. So have a nice day. I think if we change the terms by metabolic adaptation and you expect it to happen, then okay, we can take, I know this is gonna happen. I can do this to not to prevent it because it's gonna happen at a given point, but maybe I can do this, maybe, and that's actually the next thing I would like to cover. What can we actually do about it? I think the first step in regards to anticipating all these adaptations is precisely the duration and the magnitude of the deficit. Would you agree that that's kind of the first thing we should focus on?
Yeah, I think, ultimately, we're not trying to stop it from happening because, we'd love to, but it's going to happen. What we're trying to do is
Sure.
make sure that we're not exaggerating it, we're not exacerbating it. we want to make sure we attenuate it as much as possible and deal with some of the effects of it. So as you mentioned, the magnitude of the caloric deficit is one of the things that drives it, right? So there's really two things that drive metabolic adaptation. One is the acute size of the caloric deficit. You know, today in the last few days, how big is your caloric deficit? So if we take someone who's really lean and we just give them like 3,000 extra calories and they just eat like crazy for a day, their energy expenditure will acutely go up, right? So I mean, there's an acute aspect of this that plays a role. Another thing that plays a role is your overall body fat level. So like I said, as fat cells start to shrink, they produce less leptin, and ultimately that's what's driving this. Now, if someone has a fat loss goal, we can't tell them to just prevent their fat cells from shrinking, because then they're not going to achieve their fat loss goal, right?
But
So
that'll be sweet, so.
yeah, I mean, but that is the process is shrinking fat cells.
Sure.
So there's nothing we can do about that part. But what we can do is manage the size of the caloric deficit. And so what I usually encourage people to do is, like I said, small deficit that's still effective. You know, we don't want it to be the smallest possible deficit because it's going to take us forever to lose the weight. But losing 0.5% of your body weight per week, maybe as high as 1% per week, that's a good middle ground where we have a big enough deficit that we're making progress in a reasonable time frame, but we're not exaggerating the deficit such that we're going to run into even larger adaptations that could be avoided. So that's the first part. The second part is we want to deal with some of the secondary effects of metabolic adaptation. We can't do this without a caloric deficit. It just has to be there. We can't do it without letting fat cells shrink. But when we talk about the real downsides of metabolic adaptation, it's, you know, what can we do to avoid excessive hunger? What can we do to avoid excessive drops in total energy expenditure? What can we do to help us maintain muscle mass? Because obviously as testosterone's going down, that's not going to be very helpful for maintaining muscle mass when we see that drop in sex hormones. So we want to try to do our best to counteract some of those effects of metabolic adaptation. So first of all, making sure we have plenty of protein in the diet. That's going to be really helpful with hunger and with helping maintain muscle mass. Of course, we want to have a really effective resistance training program. That's also going to help us maintain as much muscle mass as we possibly can. We want to avoid doing excessive amounts of cardio or aerobic exercise because the last thing we need to do is further skew our ratio of cortisol to testosterone. We want to keep our testosterone as high as we can. We want to minimize excessive increases in cortisol. And ultimately, one thing a lot of people don't know is that cortisol and leptin have an antagonistic relationship. So the effects of cortisol actually oppose the effects of leptin. So that's another reason we want to carefully manage our training load, our overall volume of exercise in general, because we want to have a great training stimulus, but if our testosterone and cortisol ratios get too far out of whack, it's not going to be very helpful for what we're trying to do. So plenty of protein in the diet, plenty of fiber to help with hunger. We don't want our fat to get too low in the diet because if we really excessively restrict fat, that can have an unfavorable effect on sex hormones, even independently of our weight loss. So making sure that we have at least at least 0.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body mass. That's the absolute lowest I ever go on a diet. And so those are some of the main things we can do. It's about the size of the deficit, managing our training load, managing our macronutrient intakes to help us maintain muscle and fight hunger as much as we can. Of course, the reduction in non-exercise activity, we can easily try to offset that by just working more non-exercise activity into our day. Like I said, planning a couple walks per day or having a step count goal each day. Those are very easy ways that we can plan for that and offset some of those unfavorable impacts of metabolic adaptation. And then there's some other things we can try to do that aren't fully conclusively proven to work yet, but they definitely seem like potential strategies, and there's really no downside. So the two that come to mind are refeeds and diet breaks.
Right, right.
So we talked a little bit about the size of the deficit being very important, and we also talked about leptin driving essentially all of this. There are some studies where they just inject extra leptin, and all these problems go away. Like it works really well. So when we talk about refeeds and diet breaks, leptin levels are pretty responsive to acute energy status, and they're also pretty responsive to carbohydrate intake specifically. So if we have a couple days in a row, or even a couple weeks in a row, where we increase our calorie intake mostly from carbohydrate, we can temporarily increase our leptin levels. And so the thought process is maybe if we have regular refeeds or diet breaks, maybe we can help minimize some of these metabolic adaptations. It's very speculative. I think that the diet breaks seem a little bit more promising than refeeds. And the main difference there is that refeeds are usually 1 or 2 or maybe 3 days of pretty notably increased calorie intake. So it's a larger increase in calorie intake, again, almost exclusively coming from carbs, but it's a shorter phase. When we talk about a diet break, we talk about 1 or 2 weeks where instead of being in a caloric deficit, we go straight to maintenance, not
Sure.
above maintenance, but just right to maintenance. So it's a longer time frame, but a smaller increase in calories each day in most cases. And there's some evidence to suggest that these strategies might be a little bit helpful. They're not going to prevent metabolic adaptation. They're not going to reverse it, but they might be a little extra strategy that can help. And like I said, the good thing about these strategies is there's no obvious downside, aside from the fact that it might take you a little bit longer to hit your weight loss goal. Anytime we're increasing calories, no matter how we're doing it, it's going to take a little bit longer to get to our fat loss goal. But it's one of the nice things about refeeds is even if they don't actually help with metabolic adaptation, even if they're not meaningfully changing leptin levels, it's still fun to have a couple days of higher calories. And for a lot of people, that can help them stay on track with their diet. And getting the extra carbs in can help us in the gym, right? So if you have a really
Sure,
big
sure.
leg workout and that's a muscle group you really need to work hard to maintain, having some extra carbs the day before can help out completely independent of metabolic adaptation. So that's pretty much the entire list of things that we could realistically hope to do in terms of not just attenuating metabolic adaptation, but also trying to deal with some of the consequences of metabolic adaptation.
Right, right. So a question comes to mind. Do you think I'll stop being natty if I start injecting leptin? Will I
Uh,
lose my natty status?
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Oh man,
mean, definitely. Yeah.
you can never win with these things, right?
Well,
So
it is funny though. So like, I have had people like whenever I write this stuff, I kind of it's always under the assumption that you are drug free, and
sure.
I have had people ask me like, "Hey, what happens if I'm not drug free and I use exogenous leptin and thyroid hormone and testosterone?" And my answer is, you solved it. You're good. You got all the stuff that, I mean, you got all the stuff that goes down. So, it's pretty much managed.
You don't need to worry about this anymore. So in regards to diet breaks and refeeds, I think until I think it was a couple of months ago, we didn't have any direct studies on this. The only one I can think of it was the Matter study, but now we have one. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, by Bill Campbell. Is it Bill Campbell
Correct.
that actually did refeeds? And what I recall from that study is that the condition of refeeds actually preserved more lean body mass and lost more fat mass. But well, we I don't recall the details of that study. We would need to look at how they measure it because well, that's a huge component of is it really lean body mass? Is it muscle? Is it water? Is it whatever? We don't really know for sure until we look at the details of that study. But do you think with that new information that came up recently, can we actually begin to implement refits with a little bit more confidence?
Well, as you mentioned, the details are really important. And Bill's a good friend of mine. I've talked to him at length about that study. And it's important to recognize that the study did find small benefits when it comes to resting metabolic rate, the retention of lean mass, and also, I believe, the loss of fat mass a little bit. But the things that
Sure.
really stuck out to me were the maintenance of resting metabolic rate and the maintenance of fat-free mass. These were small changes, okay? Very small changes. And like you said, some people think that it's possible that carbohydrate intake might have skewed the lean body mass measurements. Okay, so if you do like carb loading before you get your body fat tested, most methods are going to say that you increased your muscle mass or
Yeah,
your
right.
body mass. So some people have some very legitimate critiques of the study, not saying it's a bad study, but saying, hey, we need to very carefully interpret the results. And so it's one of those interesting studies where I personally know people that I respect and like who, one person says that study is very good evidence that refeeds would be beneficial. And another person says that study does not provide good evidence that refeeds are beneficial. Neither of them is necessarily wrong. It is a very nuanced interpretation of very, very small changes. So what we can say for sure, the refeeds were not worse than not having them. The refeeds certainly had no negative impact. There might have been a small positive impact, and if there was a positive impact, again, it was quite small. So when I look at the results of that study, I still have optimism that these refeeds might have a small beneficial impact. But it's also reassuring to know that if you don't want to use refeeds, you're not missing out on anything huge. This is not going to be the thing that makes or breaks your fat loss goals. You can be very successful with or without them. I do think it's possible that they confer a very small additional benefit, but it's really critical to recognize exactly how small those effects were.
Like you said previously, I think most of these possible benefits come down to the psychological aspect. Let's say you have 1 or 2 days with extra carbs. Well, you can relax a bit, you can watch something on Netflix, and that kind of sets you up on a better mood for the week ahead or whatever. And okay, maybe we still are not exactly sure. It could help us on the long term preserving more lean body mass, but how much would it be actually relevant for somebody that's not a competitive bodybuilder? Probably not. And the benefits, the psychological benefits, I think outweigh the things we're still not sure about.
Yeah, and that even comes up when you look at the Matador study. So just for listeners, the Matador study was looking at diet breaks, 2-week diet breaks. And a lot of people look at that study and say, it's clear evidence that the diet breaks reduce metabolic adaptation and improve fat loss. Other
Right.
people look at that and say, I think that the diet breaks just helped people adhere better to the diet. Those 2-week breaks helped them relax, have a little bit higher calorie intake, refocus, and then they were ready for another 2-week fat loss phase. It was basically repeated 2 weeks of maintenance, 2 weeks of fat loss over and over. And again, both sides of that argument have justifiable points that could very well be defended. So again, it's one of those things that highlights with the Matador study, those diet breaks, we can say with certainty they had no negative effects. We could argue that they had positive effects or physiologically, actually influencing the stuff we're talking about here with metabolic adaptation. Or you could argue that the benefits observed in that study were only related to the psychological benefits,
Right.
helping people adhere to the diet more effectively. But sometimes people try to throw those results out altogether by saying, oh, it was all psychological. Diet breaks just help people do better on their diet and have better adherence. And I say, what's the problem with that?
Yeah, right,
That's
right.
a good thing.
Sure.
So, I mean, maybe it's not a cure to metabolic adaptation, but we just saw two groups of people. One did way better on the diet, and they seemed to have a better job, have a better time adhering to the diet. So you could argue about exactly why it seemed to be beneficial,
Right.
but the results were quite good.
And it's not like we need a cure anyway, because we're not talking about a disease. We're talking about something we just need to brace for. And this can be a potential strategy precisely on that psychological aspect that some people tend to disregard, like, oh, it's only psychological. Well, it's only psychological. Like it's going to have a big impact precisely on diet adherence. We now know that diet adherence pretty much determines if we're going to make it or not. So I think that's why it's so interesting to keep talking about repeats and diet breaks. The only downside I can think of that you already mentioned previously is the length of the diet. If we go by the matter of story 2 weeks and 2 weeks, well, it's going to be double the time that you go without diet breaks.
Yeah, I mean, that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that there's pros and cons to using refeeds or diet breaks. And there is some evidence that they might have a small positive benefit. It could be physiological, could be psychological, but you don't need them. So the
Correct.
last time I got really, really lean, I did a bodybuilding show. I won my pro card, then I competed on the pro stage. Last time I did that, zero refeeds, zero diet breaks. Okay. And for
Damn.
me, it's because psychologically, I didn't need it. I preferred psychologically just being on the same diet every day. I thought that was a very smooth process. There wasn't a bunch of volatility. It was a very easy, straightforward approach. Eat less than you're burning, get lean, get on stage. It was pretty simple stuff. And it worked
Right.
very well. And even during that diet, I believed that refeeds and diet breaks can be helpful. But for me, the psychological detriment was that I don't like having all the fluctuations in my caloric intake. Personally, I much prefer a more even approach just from a psychological perspective. I don't like having all the ups and downs. And so the psychology can go both ways, but the important thing to recognize, as we've reiterated, is you don't need them, but they might be a little bit helpful. And, I kind of joked about the cure to metabolic adaptation. We know what the cure
Right.
is. The cure to metabolic adaptation is get out of a caloric deficit and regain all your weight. If you do that, you're good. Like it will all be back to normal in time. So when it comes to choosing these strategies, it really just depends on how much you want to focus on managing that reduction in non-exercise activity and total energy expenditure. Adding in these refeeds, these diet breaks can be a very helpful thing. Maybe it's physiology, maybe it's psychology. In my writing, I've admitted I think they might be, I'm thinking it might have a small potential benefit. What I'm really excited about is I know for a fact that 2 additional studies have been done on diet breaks. None of them are published yet, but I know they will be published soon. And I'm really excited for that to happen so that I can look into all the details of them. And I
Sure.
think it's going to help us really enhance our understanding of how helpful these can be.
Do you think there's actually a physiological aspect that we can learn about from these studies? There's a potential to this?
I think so. I think obviously what it's going to come down to is looking at the details of the study, looking at
Sure.
what was measured and how it was measured. And ultimately, the types of measurements involved are going to dictate how much we can learn about it from a physiological perspective. And then, of course, how well they control for things like dietary adherence and things like that. That helps us really separate the psychological components from the physiological components. So these 2 studies exist. I know they've been done. I know who did them, and I'm just waiting for them to get published so that we can actually all publicly kind of discuss what they found and figure out how to make sense of this stuff.
It's kind of a tease, man, but it's okay. No worries. We should. I hope those studies get published and then we can actually read them en masse. I've been a fan of mass for a while now, so I hope that day comes. We can actually make, let's say, better decisions in the long term for ourselves or for clients. So I don't want to take advantage of your time. So can we give some practical takeaways for the listeners? Okay, we already established some, let's say the magnitude and the size of the deficit, the protein consumption, a minimum fat intake, engaging in resistance training. Is there anything else we can add to all of this?
Yeah, the only other ones were, making sure that we avoid excessive cardio. Cardio's not bad, but we want to make sure we're managing our overall training load so that we're not exacerbating any of these issues. And then, of course, speculate a little bit of speculation. It's possible that refeeds and diet breaks might play a role physiologically, and if not physiologically, then certainly psychologically for some people who prefer to have that kind of non-linear intake of nutrients. But the biggest thing I would say in terms of practical takeaways is to understand who's at highest risk for running into some of these issues. So even risk is too severe a word. I mean, just
Yeah, so scary.
understanding who's more likely to have greater adaptations during their fat loss phase. It's people that lose large amounts of weight and people that are getting very, very lean. And for those individuals, the biggest practical thing is understanding what these adaptations are, understanding why they occur and that they are not a problem. They are just an adaptation. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing broken. And planning for that, I think, is a really helpful thing. So I've talked to Eric Helms about this. He and I have both had the same experience, which is I did one bodybuilding prep, got very lean, and had a bad time. It was a very unpleasant experience. My weight regain after the competition was very, it wasn't ideal. I'll put it that way. So,
Sure.
it was just a very rough process. The next time I competed, I knew about all this stuff. I had studied it in depth. I knew what to expect. I knew how I could do my best to minimize its impact. And it was such a smoother process. I had the weight loss phase was much more enjoyable. I still got lean. I still had low testosterone. I still had low leptin. I still had low thyroid hormone. I didn't stop any of this stuff from happening, but I knew I was doing everything I could to attenuate it, and I knew to expect those things. And then what happened was the fat loss phase was much more pleasant. The weight regain phase was much more controlled, much more pleasant, not nearly as jarring an experience. It was a much smoother process overall. So, talking to Eric Helms about it, he had the exact same experience. One prep where things were just terrible, another prep where they were much more enjoyable. And the only difference was knowing what was happening, why it was happening, and what we can realistically hope to do about it.
Very well. So finally, do you think we can establish maybe some cues for when to implement maybe a refit, maybe a diet break? Let's say you're feeling really tired. Let's say your step count's going down. Can you consider some of these things to say, okay, maybe I can benefit from a refit. Maybe I can benefit from a diet break?
Yeah, so a lot of times what I'll find with clients, I work with plenty of clients myself, we'll start a fat loss phase, everything will go very smoothly, and then eventually at some point we'll run into what I call friction. So just if things aren't going quite as smoothly as they used to, we have a little bit more hunger, a little bit more lethargic, weight isn't really coming off as quickly as it used to. When we start noticing friction,
Sure.
that's where we start implementing some of those things. So very rarely do I start using refeeds and diet breaks the moment we begin weight loss. It's okay, you can do it. There's nothing wrong with it. But I usually wait until we run into some kind of friction. It becomes obvious. When you're working with a client, they start telling you more frequently, man, I was really tired the other day in the gym. I
Right.
was really hungry. Man, body weight is just really stable. It's really stalling. That's when it becomes clear that we're in that zone where it might make a lot more sense to do that.
Very well. So I think that covers it. Eric, I'm really grateful for your time. I really learned a lot. I hope the listeners too. And well, I'm really, again, flattered and honored to have you with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it and I really enjoyed it.
Me too, man. So have a nice day. I hope we can do this some other time. And thanks again, Eric. Have a nice day.
Absolutely. Take care.
See you.